Perfect. So, yeah, candidate experience, there's a huge number of different things that you can speak about. So I actually thought I'd speak about something that's a bit more meta, something a bit more, yeah, I suppose universal. This is a manufacturing technique that I found really useful in taking that and applying it to different processes. So, yeah, it's a weird title. What the heck does it mean? Yeah, it has some of the worst book covers you've literally ever seen. Like, they are awful, but the content inside is actually good, I promise. So, in essence, the theory of constraints is a continuous improvement process. And this is something that just really helps work out exactly where things are going wrong. And the reality is that actually it treats it very much as a number of different constraints. Imagine, for example, water flowing through a system. You know, there's always one bottleneck, but once you remove that bottleneck, there's another bottleneck. And that's what happens. So normally what you'll find is going through this process, you'll find these things move and change around, and it's very difficult. Someone says, well, you know, why aren't you hiring fast enough? Why isn't the candidate experience good enough? Now, the reason is, oh, you're like, this is the problem, and you fix it, and then something else becomes the problem. So this is a process that helps you go through this in a sort of systematic way. And I think it's really good for very complicated systems, and to be honest, there's nothing in the people and talent world that is simple because it involves people. So yeah, definitely very much around getting as much complexity out of your brain and onto something so it's visible, and then looking at it and exploring it in a logical way. So this is a first draft, a candidate journey flow that I did when I started at Cytora, and it's all of the different ways in which people can enter our funnel, the decision points, some of the questions that go through, and actually a lot of the work here is done very much in the around that, talking about the flow of these things, making it really obvious. Again, there's nothing here. If you guys recruit, this is all pretty simple. It looks complicated, but actually these feedback loops are pretty simple in terms of if someone's a no, you know, send them a rejection email. If you've gone to a certain point, then maybe you want to give them a call and actually explain to them why they're not progressing, etc. But again, if you don't visualize these things, it's not obvious what should be done at each step. And I think a lot of the problem that you get with candidate experience is very much about lack of clarity, whether that be within what the role is, whether that be, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, who's responsible for it, who's driving it, who are the key stakeholders within the business outside of the line manager, etc. So yeah, as much clarity as possible and as much visualization as possible. And again, this is going back to what I talked about in terms of identifying the bottleneck. So this is a classic situation where you have buffers. So this might be someone's diary, for example. This might be a meeting room. What is something that we found as a startup that happens frequently is that we literally have nowhere to book interviews because other people are booking meeting rooms, etc. So literally looking at visualizing all of these things, these bottlenecks, analyzing each one of them, working out which one of them is most constrained, and then subordinating the system to that. So again, yeah, they shift and move pretty frequently. You'll find week to week, someone's diary, for example, is a classic example of this. If they're on holiday, that's a full bottleneck. And suddenly you start building up interviews for them following the week after, and then they move them and shift them and everything starts going wrong. So yeah, these are some prime candidates for bottlenecks, things to look out for. Hiring managers' time, meeting rooms, founders. If you've got founder interviews, that's 100% going to be a bottleneck. And then again, if you've got multiple different roles, like candidate flow and sourcing, getting the right number of candidates at the right time, and that will maybe become more obvious later, it's really tricky because you can't predict it. You don't, if it was very easy to predict when you would get the right number of candidates that fit the criteria for a role, our jobs would be a lot easier. Sometimes they seem to come like buses. You get 3 at a time. More often than not, you're spending your entire time going around in circles, sourcing for something that the one role that you can't fill, whereas everything else is going smoothly, etc. So these are some of the areas to look. Once you've established which is your actual bottleneck, because there's a lot of different criteria for this, work out which is the problem. You probably have a gut feel about it, but it's actually worth doing a bit of analysis. So, looking at the number of available slots in a meeting room, while it sounds really trivial, and like really messaging that back to people. It's like, why are we not hiring enough people? Well, if we have a 25% conversion rate from final stage, and we only have 4 hours of available meeting room spot, which happened one week for us, we said, well, we can only possibly hire one person if everyone's perfect. And actually, if you want us to hire for 4 different roles at the same time, we've only got, it's unlikely we're going to fill any of them, really. We've got a 25% chance on each of them. So getting very detail and data-oriented around that. This is our most common bottleneck. This is Don, our engineering director. He is the bottleneck. He very much has to see every engineer that we hire. We have to hire a lot of engineers. He's the bottleneck. The more engineers we hire, the more one-to-ones he has, the more of a bottleneck he is. I've told him this. This is his nickname at work. So what we've done is we've really re-engineered the process to subordinate everything to the bottleneck. Now, we've not told him this because he would definitely lord it over us. But we've restructured our interviews. So we used to have an hour and a half, and actually it turns out an hour and a half with Don is just a lot of time, really difficult to actually fit in as well, and actually, in a weird way, tessellate with other interviews. So now it's only an hour, fits much better with his diary, means that we can fit it into smaller gaps. We've rearranged it also. He doesn't necessarily need to take part in the junior interviews at all. So very much like persuaded him that you've hired good people, trust them to make decisions. Again, classic scaling issues. We've rearranged all the one-to-ones. They were spread out really nicely and evenly. That's a complete nightmare because it meant there were no gaps, solid gaps in the diary where we could book interviews. So now one-to-ones are more regularly scheduled in blocks so he can go through them. Again, there's all sorts of issues with that, but we're optimizing here for the global system. And we to go with that, we pre-book sometimes in diaries if we know that it's going to be a really busy meeting. So these are all things that you guys know and can do, but actually they really help with making things move fast. So then there's this idea of elevating the system constraints to the optimum flow. This is a really interesting one about you're not actually looking for as many people through the system as possible. The reality is that there is an optimum flow. Like, it's not as many as you can get. And if you're scaling rapidly, if you're hiring rapidly, one of the key things where things start to fall through the gaps for candidate experience are actually when you're trying to fit too much through the system. So when you're interviewing 8 people a day, that's not an optimum flow. The engineering director can't do anything. They can't make notes. They can't fill in all the feedback. By the end of the day, they're not going to be able to process that volume of interviews. So it's about a bit more of a balance about that optimum flow through the system. And actually that, when you're trying to push things through the system too fast, that's often when things start to go wrong. And that's when candidate experience suffers, from what I've seen at least. Because again, like that time to feedback, that's such a critical measure of actually being able to give a good candidate experience, understanding like whether someone is going to be progressed or not. These things get lost in a deluge of candidates. Now, sometimes that's unavoidable, but the more that you can understand this optimum flow, the faster things do move through the system. And again, like we don't, and then begin the cycle again. And again, one of the things that we very much don't do is build up the number of candidates that we're going to view. So this has started to give us a much more predictable system, actually, so slightly slower than your absolute capacity, gives you much more predictability about when people are going to come through, because you know that you're not going to be suddenly chasing for feedback on 5 candidates. And we've all been there where someone's like, yeah, one of them was good. Was it the second or the third? And you're like, no, like, talk to them, like, talk about them by name, right? Like, you've got all the details. You should have taken notes. You should know what you're talking about here. So very much about making that system predictable, and then actually forecasting upon it and talking about it, and actually like highlighting these things before they're a problem. So if you know you need 4 final stages to get a expected hire of 1, and you can work back through all your conversion percentages, you can check the current pipeline to see whether you're expecting to hire 1 person from that pipeline. And if so, then maybe you actually want to stop sourcing. Maybe you want to stop sourcing at 0.7 expected candidates, where you're saying, I've got a good volume here, I've got a 70% chance of filling this. Like, I'm pretty confident that there's things that need more of my focus. So again, it's about working about that predictability and that flow through the system. I should have moved the slide earlier. That slide. Yeah, and again, like, key for this is like very much like that lean output. So we only book people in for this week or next week. We don't do it 2 or 3 weeks time. So much can happen in that. People can completely forget about the half-hour conversation you had on the phone with them. They can completely forget even what company it is, and sometimes they don't even turn up because they've not given them enough and then kept them up to date. So very much like keeping a small number of people and only looking that far in advance. Also, if you've got any requirements that change, which I promise never happens with you guys, but for me it happens a lot, then that means that you've not booked out interviews for 4 weeks in advance. It means that you've not got candidates who, hey, this one's really great, but I've got an interview booked in 3 weeks. I really want to see that candidate. Completely useless. By that point, the candidate, they're like, yeah, that first one was best. They're gone. They're off the market. They've got another offer. You need to really make sure that you're, only booking in people in that sort of time frame. So yeah, for this, like, one of the things by keeping this really lean, like, our offer to candidates. So like, from when they enter our system to when we send them an offer is on average 15 days for those that we've hired. So that just shows like that we've been able to put them through a very streamlined process, but actually they've already had 4+ hours of interaction with people at Cytora. So actually we have a really good view on whether they are going to fit with us. We've worked on it a lot and we've been very successful with it. And speed is not everything, but actually when we're talking about outcompeting a larger company with more resources like we spoke about, there's no large company in the world that can achieve this rate unless it's contractors on hundreds and hundreds of pounds a day. So this is one of the things that really keeps us able to get the talent that we want in the market and gives us a huge competitive advantage. So yeah, again, I could talk all day about this. There's a ton of other things that you need to do in terms of upfront. We were speaking earlier about actually, before things even enter the recruitment system, how you need to work out, what you're actually looking for, how all that pertains. Getting all of those basics right allows you to have a good candidate experience. More often than not, I find that good candidate experience, a bad candidate experience is totally avoidable, but usually only after it's happened. So you understand exactly what went wrong. It's really clear, but it wasn't preventable because you didn't spend the time up front understanding all of the different things around the system and within the system that stop you from being able to deliver that performance. So there you go. Yeah. Here are some further reading if you guys are interested. And again, these are the books with the terrible, terrible front covers. I don't know, maybe get them on Kindle. So yeah, the goal is the classic that started off the movement, very much manufacturing focused. It's actually a novel, as is the Phoenix and Rolling Rocks Downhill. So these are kind of like business novels. They're a bit cheesy, but they get to the point of like working on these cycle times, reducing batch size, etc. All of these like processes that come from a lot of these things Agile came from. Understanding these help you dramatically improve the process, which in turn improves candidate experience. Logical thinking process is another one. So once you, if you're not looking at just the system, you're looking at why, a bit more about why things aren't going that well or what you can do to improve it. This is another area that you can look that zooms out a bit more than just on the actual process, but a bit more around the whole business of how, what you need and when. So yeah, cool. That's me. Any questions?